many distinguished colleagues and so many excellent participants. It's you guys that make this worthwhile. Fred came from, Professor Foldvary came from a very long way off to be here, as did the Schoolland. And we only do this because you guys are our reward. And so we're really honored and pleased that you gave us your valuable time, that you were dedicated enough to come here with your interest. And your participation, I have to say, with all due respect, this was one of the more interesting groups that I've done in a workshop like this. So I want to applaud you.
Because we respect you also.
Yeah, and I want to also comment on the sheer friendliness of this group and the ability to. I learned something about the Romanian nature. It's almost desperation to be funny. I really. It's been a lot of fun. And even from the bad boys. Some of them I don't understand are not in jail. But anyway, maybe they released you for this. But so anyway, thank you. So now, once again, I bailed out on my proposed topic. You know, when we got together to organize all this, you know, we didn't have time to sort of, you know, fit in all of our talks together. So Lee Schoolland suggested that I might give this kind of talk because many of you have expressed an interest in what's going on in Asia and China in particular. But what this also does, and what my intention is, that this will allow you to apply many of the foundational concepts about the free market ideas or the free society ideas that we've been trying to present to you in the broad framework or the more narrow framework of Austrian economics. So this is what I'm hoping to do. Okay, so we all hear about China every day. We all wonder about where it's going. And you may wonder why I care about it. But, I mean, this is what I've been doing since probably 1989. I lived and taught in China and Shanghai in 1987 for the first time. And that was part of my sort of transition into being concerned with the post-communist or transitional economies. You know, I used to do quite a lot of writing about East and Central Europe, but I kept my focus on Asia now much more. So this is my primary interest in research. So let me present to you. So when we hear people speaking about what's going on in Asia, what's going on in the emerging market economy, you know, it seems to me, as an observer, that there's a number of incoherent propositions about trying to describe the world as it is. Now, some of these, for example, what we are seeing is that amid all of these global imbalances, there's a bright and shining star of emerging market economic growth. Now, so this is, it's a bit of a puzzle. You know, we've got all these global imbalances, but somehow we're supposed to believe that a relatively small segment of the overall global economy is going to actually somehow stabilize it all. That our great hope is that these countries will grow rapidly enough to somehow stabilize the global economy. Now, if you consider the global economy, the emerging market economies are a relatively small fraction. So even if they grow at a very rapid rate, they're not a big enough engine to pull the whole system into high growth. Their share is growing very rapidly, but it's still a relatively small share. So this is somewhat incoherent, but again, very intelligent people, very well-educated people talk about these things as though they make sense. But Again, if you take this and you tell a 10-year-old child, can this much pull that much, when that much is growing at half of 1% or 1%. This other small segment is growing at 8%. It's not going to be enough. Now, what we're being told is that, well, these global imbalances are something that we need to solve. What are they? Well, there are a number of them. For example, currency misalignments. You know, some currencies are overvalued, some currencies are undervalued. And these are sort of unstable or destabilizing conditions. For example, many people in the West, in particular the United States, is constantly complaining to the Chinese, do something about your exchange rate. You're keeping your exchange rate artificially low. You're taking away our manufacturing base, and this is unfair. The other thing that and partly as a consequence of that, we see relatively large trade deficits or relatively large trade surpluses. And these things are seen as destabilizing. And so we find that the countries with relatively large external economic sectors are affected by this. Of course, in the United States, the international sector of the United States economy, what proportion do you think it would be? 1%, 90%, 2%, 80%? What do you think it would be? Around 15%. Not so big, is it? So, in a way, one has to wonder why there's so much focus on the international sector of an economy as large as the United States economy, when so little in a way is at stake. Well, now, these imbalances are bad, but the high rate of growth in the emerging market economies is good. Well, okay. But it turns out that one is related to the other. Right? Because these exchange rate misalignments are what help drive China's economic growth. And these trade surpluses are part of that outcome. Well, you see what I'm saying? This is just incoherent. I mean, we're not using just pure logic. I mean, again, this isn't economics, this is kind of logic, isn't it? Again, you take a non-economist and you say, if this is good, but this causes that, and it's bad, then how can one be good and the other be bad? Now, what's happening is that the global economic imbalances are behind the high economic growth in the emerging markets. But the primary destabilizing factor is not China's exchange rate. Forget about it. That's China's problem. That's China's stupid mistake. Now, for me, it's a fundamentally stupid mistake, but I'll discuss that later. That's something they should have to live with. The destabilizing element, as we've been told by many of my colleagues, there's an expression in English: money is the root of all evil. And the central banks of the world have proven that. When I was a child, I thought it was a different thing, but maybe we should say fiat money is the root of all evil. Because most of these imbalances are an inevitable outcome of bad central bank policy. Much of it starts with, but doesn't finish with, the United States Central Bank, which then prompts or induces other central banks to make the same stupid mistakes. And it's partly because of stupid domestic policies. For example, China wants to keep its exchange rate artificially low, so we're going to export more. Now, if the United States lowers its interest rate, then China and many other, not just China, but the other countries that are obsessed with exporting, they want to lower their interest rates, although they may start at a higher rate. They move theirs down at the same time. And they follow in lockstep. So maybe we should say dollar fiat money is the root of all evil. Because I can trace virtually all of the economic and financial unhappiness in the world today, whether it was a property bubble in Romania over the last few years, back to the misbehavior of the American central bank, which prompted other induced other central banks to do the same stupid thing. And that was to keep interest rates artificially low. In fact, ridiculously low. I mean, the interest rates in a country like, for example, Indonesia. Normally, in a country like Indonesia, you need a fairly large risk premium because of the high risk of the institutional instabilities and so on. Now, these things have almost disappeared. The interest rates in Indonesia are very close to what they once were in the United States not so very long ago, where you don't have a risk premium on investments. So, now, a question arises, all of this high growth that we're supposed to be seeing in these emerging market economies that are supposed to be pulling the world economy along, is it real or is it imaginary? By imaginary, I mean, is it a bubble? That is it really just air? That there's nothing under to support it? Well, I'll give you a hint about the punchline. It's bubbles. And Ben Bernanke, doubling down on the poor policy choices of Alan Greenspan, who was a disaster as a central bank. Well, and given the brief of central bankers, which is to do what? Finance governments so that they can prosecute wars and misspend money on the welfare state. Right? Isn't that the fundamental role of a central bank? As we see it, of course, the central bank says, we're here to help you. We're stabilizing the banking system. What? You seen the U.S. banking system lately? How stable? We're here to stabilize the value of the currency. Not so long, well, when the Federal Reserve System, the Central Bank of the United States, was formed, the U.S. dollar traded for about $20 and then $25 an ounce for gold. Today, let's call it 1,600. It may be there Friday of next week. Who knows? How effective have they been? And how do we take these people seriously?
They clonated illness into the system.
Yeah. So I gave you sort of the punchline here and where I'm going with the Chinese economy. Now, the other incoherent statement that has been presented, and again, maybe a lot of you don't read these things, but there's a lot of talk about a decoupling. It used to be that the emerging market economies depended upon the developed economies, so they sort of moved in tandem. You know, maybe it's a little, but they moved more or less in tandem. And now it's like they can do what they want to do. So they can grow fast if the Western economies grow slow. Well, I mean, how is this working? I mean, how is it possible that if the emerging market economies depend upon the markets for the developed economies, which are very much larger in terms of overall economic activity, how is it that they can do so well without access to those markets? Well, in fact, they really can't. Or what we will find, well, okay, and so therefore the argument is, we've got the emerging markets, they're going to save us. So the little guy's going to pull the big guy that's sort of gotten over Japan. Who's going to pull Japan out of recession? The second largest, never mind all the data, the second largest economy in the world in terms of anything that makes sense in reality. It ain't going to happen. It cannot happen. Now, another incoherent statement that had been, or parallel, is that China gives us evidence that authoritarianism is is good for economic growth. Now, the story of China in the transition phase is that China went from a Marxist-Leninist state to a Leninist state. So they gave up the economic dogma that suffocated them. But they can't give up the Leninism because that's what gives the power to the Communist Party. And in fact, the entire transformation of the economic conditions, the economy in China, was all about maintaining power. It had nothing to do with, gee, we care about the Chinese people, we want to make sure everybody is happy. No, no. What are we going to do? You know, 60 years of failure. We're lagging behind the world. You know, we're Chinese, we should be proud of our heritage, what we're capable of doing. And we're a disaster economically. And so what happened is that China transformed its economic, at least in part, its economic side of this Marxist-Leninist equation, but kept the Leninists. So that, you know, they remain an authoritarian regime. But was China's success based upon authoritarianism? No. It was an economic result. So what it shows you in a way is that the market is very powerful. The market can work well even in very bad conditions because people find a way usually. Now, the other story, and the sort of counterpoint to this, or the support for this, and look at India. It's a democracy, and look how poorly they perform. Well, of course, China performed just as poorly for 60 years with an authoritarian dictatorship, and somehow people forget that. But and then China, India performed very poorly. But why did India perform so poorly after liberation from the British colonial rule? Socialism. India was a unitary state with deeply embedded socialism. So socialism suffocated the Indian economy to a lesser degree in some ways than happened under Maoist Marxist-Leninism. But democracy didn't fail India, socialism did. And authoritarianism didn't boost China, the market did. So both of these statements, which we often hear and often debate, in fact, are somewhat uninformed. Now, one of the tragedies, by the way, just as a by the way, there's a perverse irony about what's happening. I mean, given what our God democracy is supposed to deliver. Authoritarianism was the reason for reform, because dictatorships are fragile. Look at your country. You know, they seem so powerful for so long, and then all of a sudden, you see how naked they are, and how easy it is to dispose of them. I mean, it may take many years, but the end is almost always very quick. So the Chinese said, gosh, in order to remain dictators of the proletariat, we have to reform our economy. We have to make our people richer. Now, the Indians, on the other hand, because of competitive democracy, the way to gain power in India, political power, is to keep people poor. Because then they depend upon you. They come and say, please help me, I need you, we will vote, we will support you. The perversion of this. This is another sort of flaw of democracy. That it creates perverse incentives. It's in the interest of the political parties in India to keep on both sides, the BJP and the Congress, to keep people poor, to keep this dependency relationship with the state, to keep the vestiges of socialism. This is why reform is so slow in India, why it's so disappointing in many ways. Okay, so let's look at the political economy of China, in particular at this phase. From the 1950s, more or less, but for one day, I'm 1 year older than the largest country in the world. China was, modern China, or the People's Republic of China, was born on October 1st. I was born on October 2nd. Almost a year before. So I'm older by 360 or so days than the biggest country. I have to take pride in this. So China practiced autarky, that is, they didn't trade with the rest of the world. They were focused on the inside and developing their economy with great success, right? And no. Because autarky involved, and also in this case, when you had total government control of all resources, not trading with the rest of the world, had enormous inbred inefficiencies and distortions, and you know, they had internal fatal contradictions in their economy that doomed them to underdevelopment. Now, the good news was we have something like market socialism. This is what they like to call it. Or, as I mentioned, it's Leninism without Marxism. Then we had very low growth and extensive poverty, and something like import substitute. They didn't import, so they had to produce everything themselves, which meant it was high cost, relatively inefficient production, and so on. Now, the economic growth is faster than almost any other significant economy in the world, and it has been so for nearly 20 years. A friend of mine once wrote, and I thought, has anyone ever heard of Mark Twain, an American writer? He had an expression: "They're lies, they're damn lies, and they're statistics." And one of my friends wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal years ago, and I fell out of my chair because I had followed the Chinese economy a lot. And it was lies, damn lies, and Chinese statistics. Now, there are two schools of thought about China's economic growth. There's one that they're actually growing more rapidly. These are the optimists. Then there are people like me that, if you look at China's the growth in the provision of energy in China, it goes up sort of like this, and then the reported GDP growth goes up like that. So either the Chinese are dramatically reducing the energy input per dollar of GDP, or they're bullshit. And I suspect it's the latter. But in any case, they're doing well. I mean, there's no disputing. You go there, you can see they're doing well. Or at least it looks like they're doing well.
How do you know the energy statistic is right?
Well, that's okay. Yeah. It's like saying, well, you know, if someone says, "Are you a liar?" and you say yes, I say, "How can I believe you?" You must not be. Okay. Now, so China's autocrats reformed the economy, as I mentioned a moment ago, to hold power. That's what it was all about. And again, the Indians didn't reform because they wanted to hold power, but under democracy. So as I mentioned, dictatorships tend to be fragile. And this is why, has anyone heard of Wei Jiansheng? There's this Wei Jiansheng. You've probably heard of Lech Walesa. I can't pronounce it close. You've heard of him. Well, Wei Jiansheng is a little bit like that. He's a character in not so contemporary Chinese history now, because it's almost 1995 or so. But he was like a worker, and he wrote an article on what he called the Fifth Reform, because Deng Xiaoping and all the Chinese like to count things. They always have 4 bigs and 3 smalls. And anyway, so the Fifth Reform was political reform. And he was a simple guy. He was like a technician in a factory, just like Walesa was. And he wrote a very inspiring document. I can only read it in English, but it's a wonderful document. And what it is, this one guy, the entire weight of the Chinese state on this one guy. That And that proves to me they're scared to death. If one guy cannot make a public display, and this is before the internet, think how terrified they all must be now with this Arab Spring stuff in the air. But anyway, now, the interesting thing in China is that corruption tends to be a facilitating mechanism, whereas in India, to contrast India again, in India, they don't care. They don't care if things get done or not. Because the bureaucrats are sort of on the top of the heap there. They're respected. They earn reasonable salaries for the most part. They don't care. So if you don't pay them a bribe, screw off. The Chinese, they're happy to actually get things going. They're much more pragmatic. And also in India, ironically too, India, despite its images of democracy and all, ideologically, the intelligentsia or the intellectuals, whatever you want to call them, are sort of romantic communists. They hate the market. And the Chinese are very pragmatic. Even the Marxists are saying, well, because you can justify it. I mean, you can look at Deng Xiaoping two ways. Either he was a closet capitalist, or he understood Marx. Because China, remember the Soviets said, Mao, you're an idiot. Marx said you've got to go through an industrial phase, and you're trying to jump from this peasant economy into communism. You can't do that. So you could say, well, Deng Xiaoping is just a real good Marxist. He said, you've got to go through this sort of period of liberalism and industrial development so you can have this withering of the state that's promised to get out of your way. But in any case, they're very pragmatic, so I'm not really sure. That was my obituary on Deng Xiaoping. I said, he was the perfect Marxist. Because the idiots at the New York Times were saying he was the perfect capitalist. Well, they don't understand Marxism. But maybe he wasn't capitalist, who knows. Now, so one of the problems with this corruption, though, it's a zero-sum game. Now, the Chinese call it guangxi. It's sort of, it's relationships. So you buy relationships. So I buy relationships from this ministry, which means you can't. So once I get it, it's not available to someone else. But what does it do? Well, someone lower down who's enterprising said, I got cut out of that action. So I need to dream up a way to create an obstacle so that someone needs to bribe me. So there are these internal problems with this. So corruption is not such a good thing. In broad terms. Now, let me state this one thing here. China's success is something that we should all applaud and be uplifted by in terms of our concern for humanity on one broad level, but also in terms of our own interests. A strong and rich and stable China is in everybody's interest. Trade is good. More trade means more wealth to be shared by all of us. So we should not, nobody should wish ill of China. And certainly I don't. I said the other day, I've been sending love letters to the Chinese leadership for years, trying to explain to them why their economic policy is wrong. They don't love me as much as I love them. They throw them away. I guess nobody's responded. Maybe I should put a self-addressed envelope there. Anyway, now, they don't listen to me. Now, the problem is, what I'm raising here is that the sustainability of this question. So I lose sleep at night, not because I fear the yellow peril. I fear what will happen if China's economy collapses, which it could easily do. Because number one, the political system is much less stable than people believe. And the economic system is even more unstable. Now, this is maybe also another side I don't buy into, on the other hand, China's constant claims of its peaceful development. The problem is China has unresolved border disputes with all of its neighbors. All of them. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has a map of the South China Sea, which has a Chinese name for Manila on it, which is pretty interesting. That's a far reach. One could vaguely justify Taiwan's claim. But you know what? So their intent, I mean, again, they are masters of diplomacy. The Chinese are the real masters. It's not the French. The French believe they're great at everything. And they often convince other people they are as well. But not me. The Chinese are the true masters. They really know how to manipulate, to get, and that's what diplomacy should be. To use means to get other people to do what's good for your country. And they are masters at that. And masking their true intentions. Oops. Now let's look at some of Chinese economic policies. And then we're going to sort of evaluate them within the sort of how I understand markets work and why I think it's such a problem. Now, of course, there's less central planning. It doesn't make, even in India still has a planning commission, and they still issue a 5-year plan, which is driving me crazy. In fact, believe it or not, at the Montpellier Society meeting, which is a meeting of some of the great living liberals in the world, we had the head of the planning commission talk to us. I almost left the room. I felt sick on my stomach.
EU has 7 years.
Pardon me?
EU.
Yeah.
European Union has 7 years.
Yeah, you can see the effect of that. So what's happened in China is a miracle of the market. Economic efficiency gains that gave this sort of spurt of economic growth. Now, there are limits to that. And the limits are, in particular, don't believe what you read. People talk about private banks in China, but they are of no consequence. And the biggest of the Chinese banks, private Chinese banks, Minsheng, is owned in large part by some organ of government, including the International Finance Corporation, which is a private sector arm of the International Monetary Fund, which is a quasi-government. So it's not really private in any sensible sense. That is, if they have a problem with capital, they could presumably go to the arm of the IMF for help, or they could seek help from the government. So forget about private banks in China. In terms of any real impact on the economy, the decisions in terms of access to financial assets and capital, it's all about public policy. And public policy almost never has anything to do with commercial risk analysis or rates of return on capital, value, and so on. It's about what the government wants to accomplish, and that usually is, and with a dictatorial regime, their primary concern is for employment. Because they don't want people on the streets. Young men on the streets are dangerous. And as China has become increasingly urbanized, it's even more problematic. You know, under Mao and his immediate successors, most of China's population was outside the city. But they were so worried about the urban population that for decades they impoverished the peasantry, who are this you couldn't possibly organize them all for an uprising. Where you get uprisings, of course, in the urban areas. So what did they do? They made food artificially cheap for the urban workers and comforted the urban workers and punished the peasants, starving them to death in some cases, as their reward for the liberation of China. Remember, it was a peasants' army. And their reward was being ruined in order to not reward maybe, but to keep the urban masses sort of peaceful. And this, in a way, is what's happening now. Everything's being driven. So what you have is the state-owned banks. Here you are. You're a Chinese entrepreneur. You say, I've got the best idea since sliced bread. It's going to be, Mackenzie Stewart approved it. I can't go to Goldman Sachs. They would love to have it. I need some money. State-owned bank said, sorry, we're all out because our state-owned enterprise over here needs a cash infusion. Mostly just to keep people employed, because they're losing money like crazy. So, it's as though, you think of the banking system in China, as though all the people who are working hard and have almost very few options for savings, because housing is out of reach for most people, all they can do is put it in banks or in a mattress. And then the bankers, state bankers, take the money, and it's like they go to Monte Carlo and start putting money on these numbers on the roulette wheel. They spin the roulette wheel has no numbers on it. The money, they take off. The money evaporates because it's gone into wasteful activities. Now, the capital market is closed. They have capital controls in China. And there are very few funds available to the true private sector. You read about China's economy. People talk all the time. China's vibrant private economy. There's not a big private sector in China. There's a non-state sector that's relatively large. But much of that's financed by local and township or provincial governments. And that's based as much on political connections in Guangxi as it is on the profitability, commercial viability of those countries. Now, and the other thing is, all these, almost all of this very successful entrepreneurs tend to be party members. So those things are very important. Or they become party members as a reward for being successful. So the cause and effect's not always together clear. So interest rates have no meaning in a place like China, because policy determines where. Professor Foldvary told you about what is the job of interest rates, right? But he can't speak about that in China in any meaningful sense, because it's not a market-driven phenomenon. Now, the other key element to China's economic performance is so-called export-led economic growth. But, when I started writing about this, people kept saying, wow, they've invented new economic laws. So I thought, oh my God, all my human capital is tied up in these old economic laws. I'd either better, get in on the game, or everything I know is going to be devalued. So maybe I have a special interest in trying to validate my own sort of laws and theories of economics. And in fact, I found great comfort that Adam Smith had already done the work for me. He said mercantilism was a load of rubbish in 1776. And that, in fact, what happens is that the Chinese, and this is an ironic joke on the Chinese, because how this sort of discomfort between the Chinese and Japanese it's deeply embedded. It's like the French and the German, or the English and the French, or whatever. It's just this competitive kind of distrust and envy of one another. But China's current economic policy is really an imitation of what Japan did in the post-war period. The difference was, and the reason Japan succeeded, was, think about it. Who was Japan competing with in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s? Latin America? Forget about it. Central Europe? Whoops. Russia had something to say about that. Nobody was trading. Western Europe initially was struggling to get back on its feet, right? The Middle East, Africa? Who was the competitors for Japan in that period of high growth in Japan? Nobody. And the West wanted Japan to be strong against communist China. So they were willing to take in, imports from Japan, to get Japan to be stronger. So they repressed any kind of opposition to Japanese imports, which, by the way, at least initially, were such low quality that most producers didn't feel threatened by them. In the early days, Japan produced really low quality stuff. So the trade unions and the producers in these industrialized economies, they didn't feel threatened by them. They weren't producing automobiles, right? Not yet. Now, so what happened to Japan? Well, Japan went along with no competitors, with lots of geopolitical support, until what? Well, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Korea, Thailand, Indonesia, they started imitating Japan too. And what did they do? They competed with Japan. Japan developed a bubble economy where they had massive infusion of cheap credit and money into the system. Asset values and property values became so wildly inflated that the economy collapsed at the end of the 1980s, 1989 roughly. After that, the urban real estate values in Japan dropped by 2/3. 2/3. The Nikkei dropped by roughly 2/3. You're gone. And that was the end of neo-mercantilism's success in the story. It's not a model. It only worked because Japan had the game to itself. Now, meanwhile, what had been happening in the 1970s, 80s, into the 90s? Well, that's what I said. The Taiwans, the Koreas were coming along, and they were draining off a lot of this production because Japan's economy was overheating. The exchange rate was such that the yen was very high, very strong, and so they were having trouble being able to export out of Japan, and so they were shifting production offshore. And these other economies became export-led economies. But then what happened to them? Come 1997, their bubbles burst, end of the neo-mercantilism success, and what was the primary bullet that hit them? China! By then, China was now doing to the rest of them what they had done to Japan. China ended the success of neo-mercantilism in Southeast Asia. Korea thrown in there for the mix. So, it's China's turn. Now, China doesn't face a big competitor. But the neo-mercantilism myth of success, it just takes time, unfortunately. And I don't want to see it. I don't feel good that Japan has had virtually no growth or very slow growth for the last 20 plus years. The world's not better off for that. Japan's certainly not. And the pain and suffering of the Southeast Asian economies in that post-1997 era, it's not a pretty thing. It's going to be a real mess if and when it happens in China. Question.
What was the influence of the exchange rate agreements between the US and the Western Europe and Japan? And, I think it's called the Plaza Agreement.
Yeah, the Plaza Agreement. Well, yeah, I mean, that was simply the trigger for Japan to have to start bringing its expansionary monetary policy under control. So it was a classic boom and bust cycle. What happened? Japan had this boom based upon artificially cheap credit and inflated currency, and then once they put on the brakes, boom, it ended. Now, here's another 10-year-old test. At one time, the real estate in Japan was so wildly overvalued that if this is Japan and this is Tokyo, the Imperial Palace in the heart of Tokyo was estimated to be worth more than the real estate in all of California. Okay? Now, again, you take a 10-year-old. You say, okay, this is more valuable than that. You don't have to know anything about property values. 10-year-old girl. No! Nobody, you have to be stupid to believe that. That all this land in California, but smart investment bankers with high degrees and lots of money, they couldn't wait to buy in downtown Tokyo. They were killing themselves to get there. So, oh, this is a stupidity. And these are things that are happening and happened in the United States recently for the same reason. You get these bubble effects from this loose monetary policy and cheap credit, artificial cheap credit. Now, the elements of this export-led growth, a false belief that hard currency. So China's sitting on this mountain of green pieces of paper, $2.4 trillion. And every day, they put it out that they're proud of this number. Instead of saying, for me, it's like saying, look how stupid I am. I'm terrified. I lose sleep at night seeing the foreign exchange reserve balances of China growing. The only time I will be able to sleep well at night, that's why I look so old. Well, actually, I'll stay up too late on that. When it starts going down. Because they are suffering from the same illusion that Adam Smith corrected in what the absolute monarchs of Europe were doing. They had a gold fetish. They thought that the wealth of a nation was based upon the stock of bullion. And Adam Smith said, no, it's based upon the productive capacity of the citizens. And the Chinese were saying, we're rich because we have these big pieces of green paper, a big mountain of green paper. That's even worse. I mean, I'd rather have a stock of gold myself. It's exchangeable for something. It doesn't evaporate. You can't add zeros to it just like that. So anyway, so they have an obsession with exports, just like the mercantilists did. And the reason we had colonialism and imperialism coming out of Europe is that they wanted export markets. So they went and took them. They called them colonies. Happily, China's not doing that. Japan didn't do that, at least not after World War II. But this obsession with exports, what it does, it leads to enormous distortions and imbalances in the domestic sector. So, what proportion of the Chinese population do you think makes their living in the international sector of the economy?
10%.
5%?
Maybe 5. In fact, I don't know the number, but I'll give you a ballpark number: 5 to 10%, because it's principally people living in the coastal cities. And the vast majority still lives in the hinterland. Now, what this means is that the government officials are helping funnel money into export-oriented businesses because they believe that's the right thing, because they want more green pieces of paper. Which means that the people that would be producing for the domestic consumers or for domestic consumption are shoved aside. So, is this a government that cares about its people? Hey, some of the people are wildly, very well rewarded, and the others are neglected. And also, the production structure of the overall economy is so focused on these exports that it creates an unsustainable imbalance that's got nothing to do with income differentials. It's simply the structure. The artificially low exchange rate is basically a tax on the resource owners. Primary resource owners, of course, are laborers. So that big mountain of green paper, that's a tax. And it's a very inefficiently used tax because the government's buying, principally, up till recently, U.S. government paper. Treasury bills or treasury bonds, which pay an extremely low rate of interest. So that's really a tax, and that's why I'm unhappy about that big mountain of green paper, because I know that it's impoverishing, or it's a symbol of the impoverishment of the Chinese workers, and putting their resources in the hands of government. Now, so this is the biggest imbalance in the world. And this is the most terrifying imbalance in the world. Because eventually something has to give. As I'll say in a moment, because I may have to cut it short, there is no perpetual motion machine in physics. Physicists have tried to accomplish this, but there's also not one in economics. So, people understand that. If you talk about, you say, imagine, you can't imagine a perpetual motion machine. It also doesn't exist in economics.
You can, but it doesn't prove.
So, the statement is, anything that cannot go on forever won't. And nothing can go on forever. So that mountain of green paper will eventually begin to suffocate the Chinese economy. Now, a lot of credit that was given, well, of course, it was part of the propaganda to promote the stimulus spending by these corrupt governments in Europe and the corrupt governments in Washington that wanted to validate, justify more deficits, to give them more power, to give them more resources. They said, well, the Chinese did it. They put $500 billion in their economy in 2008, roughly. And look, they had this big success. Well, what did they have? Well, they had stimulus spending, an enormous expansion in money and credit that began a boom and bust cycle. So what they did, they just pumped more air into China's bubble economy. Now, for example, the broad money supply as a share of GDP rose by 40%. It's terrifying. That money has, remember, you all haven't heard my lecture. Conventional monetary theory is that the only thing that happens when you inflate the money supply that you have to worry about as a central banker is what happens to consumer prices. Okay, but that's not the real world. That's some sort of stupid, fictitious central bank world. What happens when you inflate the money supply is it could affect consumer prices, but it also affects asset prices, commodity prices, real estate prices, exchange rates in a functioning market economy, and eventually interest rates. So there are lots of things that inflating the money supply will do. And in this case, some of it's now beginning to appear on this side. They're finally realizing, whoops, we do have some consumer price inflation. It's beginning to bubble up. And the Chinese, everybody knows how terrified the Germans are of inflation. The hyperinflation in Germany has scarred Germany forever. The Weimar Republic and then the rise of Hitler, the collapse of the Weimar Republic was all about hyperinflation. Now the only country in the world that is more traumatized by hyperinflation is China. Because if Kuomintang, the nationalist Chinese that lost to the communists, lost power because they lost control of the printing press. And the communists know that they were only able to defeat them because of hyperinflation. They know that. And they know that inflation, and certainly hyperinflation, will bring people onto the streets because that's what brought the workers and students onto the streets and into Tiananmen Square. It wasn't about democracy as such. That was a good CNN sideline. But it was fundamentally about students and workers who are on fixed incomes. Students are on very low incomes in China. And rising prices on fixed incomes ain't fun. Right? So, democracy was seen as a way of expressing a grievance, but the grievance was, you're killing us. The price rises are too high. Change it. Now, so the communist regime is terrified of inflation, consumer price inflation. So they've been focused on that, they thought they had that under control, so they ignored what was happening in the rest of the economy. So China has what I call the mother of all bubbles. Its entire economy is in a bubble state, in the sense that assets and commodities are overpriced, and we've got, again, this distortion in the production structure in China because of the monetary policy. Yes.
But did not USA help in China to this this stage right now by selling them 70% from their bonds, and in the meantime having more than 60% of the factory in China. So it's not USA and China like a chain, and if one of them broke, so both of them will...
China is the victim of a pyramid scheme.
Exactly.
A Ponzi scheme. Now, there's an idea. Now, in Romania, you had Caritas,
Yes.
which almost killed you. Now, the predecessor, the most successful one in the United States, was called a Ponzi scheme. It was named after Charles Ponzi, a guy that did it. Okay? It was more famous, but not as pervasive. And again, I meant to Google it again, but I think this caused a loss of roughly, I think it was 20% of GDP in Romania. It was enormous. I mean, 13% would be startling enough, and somehow that figure came. But anyway, it's a double-digit impact in terms of crushing your economy. Now, the biggest pyramid scheme in the world is fiat money. And China has been victimized, in a sense. Because like you said, the Americans printed more green pieces of paper, the Chinese took them and gave them things that we put into our houses, our garages, and so on. And they've been taken for suckers in a way. Because the irresponsible, and I feel, Professor Schoolland said he didn't feel apologetic about it, but I still feel maybe it's because of some idiotic identity with being an American, but I'm embarrassed by it. I mean, I'm disappointed that the central bank of the United States has destroyed this thing called the dollar, which was an crucially important mechanism for global wealth creation. And now it's about wealth destruction. And I don't know why I would feel that I should apologize, but I really feel compelled to do so. I mean, this is terrible. And China is being victimized in some ways by this. So, we gave them the illusion, so that their economy is built on the air of this excess liquidity created by but again, the Federal Reserve System in the United States wasn't alone because the other stupid central bankers followed them. They didn't have to, and they shouldn't have. For a short time during the 2000, the noughts that they call them, from 2000, the European Central Bank resisted, but eventually caved in. But, yeah. So this is basically what happened. You got, we took, and then they gave us the dollars back for other pieces of paper that had, treasury bond written on it. But, and again, I feel a little bit guilty. We got this, and they still have a piece of paper that's a depreciating asset. I mean, that's evil. That's evil. Now, it was a combination of stupidity. The outcome is evil. It's a combination of stupidity and bad economic models, rather than evil intent. We didn't intend to screw over the Chinese, but we've done it. So, in a way, it doesn't matter if it was evil intent or not. Because it's there. Whoop. Okay, so let's look at China's export-led growth and foreign capital inflow. So what we saw is that massive amounts of foreign capital came into China. Now this is an interesting phenomenon. Does China have a labor surplus or labor deficit country? Is it a labor surplus or labor deficit? Does China have a lot of labor or so it is? A lot of labor, right? It's a labor surplus economy. Now, where do you find the most advanced factories in the world? China. Now, do advanced factories use relatively more labor or relatively less labor? Okay. Oh. Okay, well,
We are not sure.
no, we do know. If you go to China, the workers are very productive. Now, those workers that work in those highly developed, high technology factories do earn less than maybe if the same factory were built in Germany or the United States. But nonetheless, what we find is that we're not exploiting cheap labor in China. This foreign capital inflow is not about cheap labor per se. It has more to do with regulation and flexible labor market conditions, which are even more important in many ways than, I mean, being able to fire workers or to hire many more very quickly could be more important than paying high wages or low wages. And this is the allure of China's labor market. It's very flexible. And also regulations are differentially lower in almost all areas. So, this led to aggressive industrialization, but almost only in the export sector. So all this foreign direct investment led to an increase by 5 times in the exports, and now China has about 9% of total global exports, which is very significant for a country that started from virtually zero in the late 1980s. China had stimulus spending, I mentioned a moment ago, combined with a loose monetary policy, and meanwhile, the local governments, they don't have revenues based on taxation. It's based upon land sales, selling or leasing land. So they need economic development so that they can sell or lease land to get more revenues to do more development. So it's just this sort of... Now, what happens then is when the central government says, look, you know, the property market is getting out of hand. You know, we're going to have to stop this development. And the local government officials go, hey, if you do that, we're toast. We are so highly leveraged. We need to have this continual flow of income, or we can't repay these debts that we've accumulated in order to do all these wonderful things that we're doing for our local inhabitants. So China's leaders are riding a tiger. Woo! Things are going well. Whoa! But you know, you got to get off to pee-pee or eat or do that. And when you get off, they eat you. They can't get off the tiger. They're trapped. They're trapped. They bought into this neo-mercantilism. They jumped onto this tiger. They doubled down with stupid stimulus policies, which created more debt. They loosened up monetary policy and kicked the machine into full gear, and off they were going. But that tiger's going to eat them one of these days. Of course, you could hope the tiger might die. But that ain't going to happen. You're going to be too weak and fall off before that happens. So now they have a domestic property bubble that's beginning to show signs of ending. That's the good news. I'm a little bit encouraged by the fact that the property bubble is beginning to lose some air. So the real estate bubble in China is that what is real estate development dependent on? Construction, right? You need workers. Steel for the supports. Cement to hold it together. And this became 13% of GDP, these sectors. Doubled in a very short period of time. These sectors grew at an enormous rate. But even so, they didn't grow rapidly enough to keep those input prices from rising very dramatically. As I mentioned, perpetual motion is impossible. So China's bubble economy is an accident waiting to happen. We don't know what the trigger will be.
I have a question. The countries in the Western world spend a lot, but they spend from borrowing or from deficit. But in China they have excellent. They have lots of money. They have the money from America, right? So don't they spend that money that they obtain from the exports?
Well, normally that would be the people's money. So it's actually, that is the people who sold things and made things. But you're right, it does go into the hands of government. Now, where do you know in the world that governments take financial resources and do good things with it? Now, China obviously didn't make only mistakes. I mean, they've got an increasingly expanded aviation sector, which is primarily by government. The highway system is vastly superior to India's. Much of it, though, was done with private money. Some of, especially in the southern part of China, done with private money on a build-own transfer scheme. Now, but on the other hand, they did the same kind of stupid thing that your friend Obama was trying to do in the United States. They want to have they've got high-speed rail in China because everybody else thinks it's a good idea. It's a bad idea. It's unprofitable. In other words, they put billions of dollars into high-speed rail that will never be profitable. It will always be subsidized. And the same tragedy is going to happen in the U.S. if it's forced through in the U.S. I'm afraid it won't. But so they're not spending the money. So I mean, governments, when they spend that money, they're spending somebody else's money, and something that would have been spent on something else. So the domestic boom in China will eventually have to end in a recession. They always do. It's no different. It doesn't matter if it's China, they speak a different language, they may look different from you or me, maybe not from her. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter the culture. It's universal. If you misbehave in the fiscal and monetary arena in the way that the Chinese government has, it's inevitable. Whoops. Now what are the indicators? Well, the external signs are China's growth must be slowing because we've seen commodity prices begin to percolate down a bit. And again, this is good news. Unless you're a copper producer, for example. Copper produced 5% early March, year on year, after roughly 34% gains in the period between 2010. Okay? So, dramatic rise in copper prices, and this is just one, but other iron ore and so on. But it's beginning to loosen up a bit. The internal signs, Goldman Sachs lowered its estimate for China's second quarter this year from 8.8, almost 9% to 8%. That's a 10% decline in the rate of growth. And Goldman Sachs, do you think that they want to give, do you think, would they tend to overstate the good and understate the bad to keep doing business with Chinese? That's my instinct. Right? So if Goldman Sachs said it's going from 8.8 to 8, I'm afraid it's going to be more like 7. Because they're going to be blowing smoke at the Chinese. They don't want to make them mad because they do lots of deals with them. So, but anyway, growth is slowing. Residential prices were down in 9 major cities by almost 5%. After they went up by 21%. We have dramatic run-ups in prices in China. Now, one of the good news aspects about the real estate bubble in China, unlike in America where almost virtually anybody could have been involved in the real estate bubble in America, only the relatively rich in China are exposed. People buying second, third, and fourth homes as speculative purchases. So, I'm probably a closet socialist somehow, but if a millionaire has 10 million, loses $1 million, and only has 9, I don't lose as much sleep as if somebody that had 100,000 and lost 50 of them. Sorry, I'm a little bit. So if the very rich in China lose even a significant amount, they're not going to collapse. They're not at a subsistence level. So that's the good news. Much of this inflation and bubble is really, but what it's done on the other hand is make it impossible for the normal people to buy housing in China.
We didn't consider this proof incidental. For example, a 5% loss in copper prices. It could be marking of profits. Maybe investors move their money from copper to gold or silver. Also, the Goldman Sachs, it's an estimate. So until we have the real data, we can't really be sure. Yeah. So it's just speculations.
Fair enough. But like I said, I think what we're beginning to see is slowing down in China. It doesn't matter. I mean, there are other factors. Now, what's been going on with China? And he put in my view, he put the thing going. China's story is about this global glut of liquidity. That is, central banks were putting so much liquidity into the system through issuing of credit and by central banks through quantitative easing or whatever, creating money. We've just got this expansionary monetary policy is behind all of this. So it doesn't stop there. So we print green pieces of paper. The Chinese did it. In order to sell to us, they buy commodities from Australia and from Chile and other places. They push up commodity prices, create bubbles in these economies, and it all could have been stopped here. The central banks have to stop playing God with money and interest rates. None of it would have happened. Now, have you ever heard this expression, carry trade?
Yeah.
Do you know what arbitrage is?
Yeah.
In a sense, this is an interest rate arbitrage technique where the yen and the dollar, the central banks are, in the United States is 0.25% interest rate. So commercial banks have access to very low, very cheap interest, cheap credit, which means you could go to an American bank and borrow at, let's say, 2.5%, convert that into Indonesian rupiah, put it into Indonesian government bonds at 6% or 8%. No brainer. That's called the carry trade. So you borrow at a low interest rate, convert it into another asset that has a higher yield. And this has been going on for a long time. And this is creating imbalances all through these emerging markets. So all this high performance in these emerging markets, a lot of it's driven by this carry trade. You borrow at a low interest rate, convert it into a currency, an asset denominated in other currency, and you just take away that differential. Now, the risk is, if exchange rates go wonky on you.
We had something like this in Romania, called the e-forex. They took advantage for the disaster, like the earthquake in Australia.
Yeah.
When the coin goes down, they bought it and they sell, or with the tsunami in Japan.
Yeah.
So they just follow this kind of things.
Sure. But what this does is help create bubbles in these asset markets in these small economies. Because, look, you know how much, Japan has the second largest stock market in the world. So, okay, so here's Japan's stock market. Now, the U.S. stock market valuation is somewhere like here. Now, that's Japan. Now, imagine if you took the value of the morning trades in New York and moved 10% of it into Indonesia. What do you think would happen to the market in Indonesia? Go through the roof. It takes what would be a trivial amount of money on the United States market to push one of these emerging markets in a big way. And this is what's happening. So people go, wow, these emerging markets are where to be. It's all based on this same problematic issue that we've talked about, this air that's creating these bubbles based on central bank policy. So we got this commodity bubble that's been, and gold is one of the elements of this. Right? The gold price is being driven by all that liquidity. It was a better place to invest than in many stock markets. Now Australia is a prime beneficiary here. Now what's happened, I read the other day that they're expecting that Australia will have the worst financial crisis for the last 30 years. It's coming up. Now, Australia happened to have an overvalued currency. Has anybody ever seen the Big Mac Index? The Big Mac Index is a way, it's kind of an acute way for economists to try to explain something known as purchasing power parity, to try to find out what does a Big Mac cost in different countries, as a way of indicating whether the currencies are overvalued or undervalued. Okay? Well, Big Mac, one of the most expensive places in the world to buy Big Macs is in Australia. So they got a very overvalued currency. To go to Australia today it's almost as expensive as going to Zurich. I was just in both places recently, and I can tell you it's very expensive in Australia. Now they've become overly dependent on the commodity exports. So all the high growth in Australia has been in the export sector. Because when I walked around Sydney and Melbourne and other cities in Australia last December, or March, I was there in March as well, all these shops were closed. You know, that is where normal people go and buy every day. There's nobody working there, there's no job there, there's no business there, it's closed. You know, it's like, I was shocked. You know, if you read the macroeconomic data, you think that everybody was employed, all the shops were open and booming, but the domestic sector is struggling. And again, most people in almost every economy work in the domestic sector. They make their livelihood and they consume from the domestic sector, mostly. So even if you have a very vibrant export sector, it ain't enough. It can give you sort of impressions of high growth.
How can the Big Mac index illustrate an overvalued currency? It's about how long people have to work to earn a Big Mac. And Big Mac is usually sourced by domestic suppliers. Maybe the meat comes from Brazil and that's it.
Well, no, it makes it harder for them to export manufactured goods, right? Having an overvalued exchange rate.
The Big Mac index doesn't show anything about the exchange rate.
Well, the implication is it has to do with what you would have to, for example, if you had $1 and wanted to buy a Big Mac, it also tells you what the Big Mac costs you in terms of dollars.
The Big Mac index shows.
Well, anyway, okay. We'll talk about the Big Mac. Let's talk about China. Okay, sorry. Now, so what's China's future? I have to pretend to be uncertain because I'm not as good as Professor Foldvary. I can't give dates as accurately as he's able to do, as he's proven he can do. But I should say, I'm quite certain that China's going to have a problem because its impressive growth is built upon hype, and some of that hype is the same kind of intelligent, well-financed investment bankers that were desperate to buy property in Tokyo before the bubble blew up in their face. The same kind of people. In fact, they may even be the same people in some cases. I used to meet these jokers in Hong Kong years ago. Man, it's unbelievable. These guys, they never get fired. And I never get a job. So, they face economic distress. Now, the bad news about China, of course, is because it's a dictatorship, there are no safety valves for public discontent. You can't join another political party. There aren't any. You can't start a political party. It's not allowed. You can't demonstrate on the street. Or if you do at great personal risk. They're not going to tolerate it. So that's one of the good things about democracy. If you're unhappy in a democracy, you can join a political party, you can vote for somebody else, you can demonstrate on the street peacefully, hopefully, unless you're a freak. But, you know, China doesn't have that. So if they have economic problems, they're going to have political problems because they're going to have social unrest.
Well, instead of joining a political party, isn't it always easier to just lobby or pay the right people? I guess you could do that in China also.
Not if you're a poor peasant or an industrial worker. You don't have that access.
If you're a poor peasant, you're definitely not going to do a lot of things by joining a party.
But there are a lot of people in China that are living close to subsistence, right? And at the same time, there are other grievances that people have. The corruption of the public officials and so on. So those things are below the surface. So it may take some other trigger for those things to come up. And those come up anyway. I mean, people feel justified going on the street to denounce corruption. But anyway, so the state-controlled banking system is going along, destroying wealth. So the proportion of bad loans, which is going to be based upon that property bubble bursting, just like it did in the United States. The end of the property bubble leads to a massive increase in bad debt, that is non-performing loans. Deeply embedded corruption in China. Domestic monetary policies help build these asset bubbles. Global monetary policy helps support it. Rising interest rates. Eventually, interest rates in the United States have to go up. They're too low. Now, I read this headline that one of the governors in the central bank of the United States says he was ready to see interest rates go up. And then I read the article that said he was really ready for them to go up to 1%. To go up to 1%? You know, when I was a student getting my doctorate, if someone said at some point in my lifetime the central bank would be struggling with trying to push the interest rate up to 1%, I would have thought they were crazy. You would be certifiably crazy. They would have to take you off in a wagon with tied up. This is unbelievable. So sooner or later, it's got to go up. Now, when it goes up, America is going to stop throwing all this crap that they buy in Walmart into their garages because they're full already anyway. And that's going to lead to a decrease in China's export. And it only has to be a decrease in the rate of increase. So so what you do, you say, well, it went up by 10% last year, so I'm going to expand capacity by 10%. Only went up by 8%. Well, the trend is 10%, so I expand by 10% to accommodate, oops, it went up by 6%. Uh-oh. Well, see, that gap widens. And then all of a sudden, you're sitting on unsold inventories. And even if you owe to a state-owned bank, there's going to be a limit to what you can do. So if you expand another 10% another year, and it's 5% growth in output, the gap is growing and growing and growing. And this is what China faces. Now, the estimates have always been that China must grow at a minimum 8% over the long term, which is impossible. It's logically, it's physically, it's economically impossible for any economy to grow by 8% over a multi-decade period. Because, you know, what happens when you've got inflation, if China's inflation begins to go up as high as it is, then the nominal growth has to be close to 20% to get 8% in real terms. Well, 20% nominal growth ain't going to go on forever. Now, so if they don't grow at 8%, that means given the rate of growth of the labor force, unemployment rises. That is, they're not able to absorb enough of the new entrants. And if that's happening, that's where I'm worried about the political stability. Because the lower rate of growth through excess capacity, rising unemployment, and all bets are off. Here comes Taiwan. What do good European governments do when young boys and men go out on the street and cause trouble? They let other governments kill them in a war. It's called World War I, World War II. It's a perfectly civilized thing to do. An old practice. They've done it for centuries. Why do you think the Chinese would be different? One of the ways to get people's minds off of crap at home is to create a nationalistic sort of rally around the flag issue, like let's go invade Taiwan. It's ours, right? This is problematic. I mean, or what about that border issue with there's crazy Indians? You know, they have all this lower Tibet that's rightfully ours. They have some stupid name for it. We don't care. It's a full state of India. But we don't care. It's ours. Let's go get it. This is dangerous stuff. You can't discount these things. And this is when I look at this green mountain of paper, why I lose sleep at night, because I worry about these kinds of results. Now, So, China's eventual and inevitable economic correction is going to be the end of this commodity boom. Australia is going to be a net sufferer. You know, you go to Australia now, these guys are all sort of, you know, for the first time, the Australian dollar is equal to the US dollar. And by the way, the Swiss franc is on par, more or less.
20% stronger.
Yeah. Now, what's happened, you know, the Australians are sort of prancing around like, you know, and again, I won't get any pleasure out of it being taken down. Yeah, it's going to be a problem. So, I told the group the other day, I said, liberals, libertarians, tend to be very optimistic people. Well, I can't be terribly optimistic. And by the way, as I've expressed with a number of people in private conversations, I'm deeply concerned about what's going to happen in the United States tomorrow. For the same reason. I mean, in a way, I could have done this whole same thing pretty much with the U.S. market, except we've just gone one step further. The approach to the waterfall that Professor Foldvary showed on the cover of his book, the Americans are closer to falling over that edge of that flood of money that's taking us over the edge. Chinese may be a little bit further back. And as I said, I guess, again, because I am optimistic, I want to interpret these numbers that I mentioned about copper prices as an encouraging sign. But I may be kidding myself. So I would argue with you just so I don't have to give up that optimism, you know. But you're absolutely right what you suggest. But I do suspect the Chinese economy is beginning to slow down. And I would want it to slow down rather than, because if it stops hard, we all have trouble. Because I do believe that the Chinese would probably start some armed conflict somewhere. It's just what governments do. It's not them, just what governments do. I'm not making any peculiar accusations. I mean, you know, if you're an American, you don't even need those kind of just go and invade people all the time. Okay, well, sorry, I don't know if I went over or not, but do you have any questions? Any more questions? Sorry about cutting you off, but
yes, if China's economy is based on exports and its main markets are United States and Europe, why didn't China's economy begin to grow when the United States and Europe?
Yeah, okay, you're right. No, I did overstate that. I mean, China has diversified by it. I mean, China, of course, obviously selling a lot of things here too.
Yes,
they're selling things in all over, closer in Asia to their neighbors. So they've actually been able to capture a lot of other export markets. But still, I said that maybe I misphrased it. The primary markets are North America, Western Europe. And what they had was a higher rate of growth in those other markets that was making up for some of the loss of sales in Western Europe. Yeah.
I think China's economy got hit very, very badly by 2 years ago, 3 years ago when the U.S. economy went down. Just give you a picture of what's happening. For example, this factory making shoes. And people went to work in the morning and find out the factory is closed. They have no warning. 1,200 people waiting at the gate. The factory is closed because the people in the United States they can't buy or sell these shoes anymore. It happens all over China in the coastal areas where the products were produced. It was hit so badly, and but it's not really the media didn't pick it up, but. People in China, they were just shocked and didn't know what to do. And their farmers, they left their farm long time ago, 20 years ago.
And some of them can go home.
Yeah, a lot of them went home actually. That's why they didn't count as unemployment, because they went home. They still had their land. They used to just lease to other people, and now they're farming it on their
That's been the safety valve like for example in Thailand as well, or these other countries that have gone through these kind of cycles, is that people were able to go back to the sort of rural areas, and it didn't lead necessarily to social unrest.
So the abandoned factories all over right now, and as Professor Lingle said, China is a master of their diplomatic skills. Now they're going to Africa, they're going to other places. So they're paying off these dictators in Africa and other places. So then the Chinese goods are going in there, and Chinese influence, and so they're struggling. China is struggling. It's not, happy, just like everything you said is happening right now.
That's why I said that US and China are like a chain connected together.
Yeah.
Because the Chinese bought 80% from the American bonds, and 70% from the factory in China are owned by the Americans. So if they close the factories, also China is down more if their bonds are. So they are